Cast out and left entirely penniless, a grieving 19-year-old orphan was ruthlessly mocked by her greedy cousins for inheriting a ruined, water-damaged painting. The arrogant heirs were absolutely certain they had successfully seized the entire family estate, gleefully tossing her out into the cold with a worthless insult. They had no idea the mouldy canvas they laughed at secretly harbored a staggering hidden fortune. And they never suspected this discarded trash concealed the exact weapon she needed to obliterate their smug expectations, reclaim the true family empire, and force them to realize they had thrown away the keys to a kingdom. Settle in, and let us travel back to a damp Gloucester's afternoon, to a story of quiet seeing and the fortune that waits for those with the patience to look. The air in the parlour of Dunor House was thick with the scent of beeswax and finality. Rose Alcott, 19 years of age and clad in a dress of mended grey wool, sat on a small, hard-backed chair near the window, slightly apart from the main gathering. Outside, a persistent autumn drizzle wept down the glass, blurring the edges of the overgrown parkland. Inside, the sound of Solicitor Davies's dry voice was a steady drone against the rustle of her cousin's silks and the clink of cherry glasses. She had loved her uncle, a man of quiet books and muddy boots, but she felt his absence now as a cold draught in a room full of bodies. Her cousins, Arthur and Eleanor, sat like crows on the velvet sofa, their eyes sharp and fixed on the solicitor's every word. They were the heirs. She was an afterthought, a niece taken in out of duty, now to be disposed of with similar efficiency. To my son Arthur, Mr. Davies read, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose. I bequeath the entirety of the Dunor estate, its lands, its properties, and all furnishings and effects contained therein, with the exception of certain items to be named. Arthur gave a small, satisfied nod, his signet ring glinting as he reached for his glass. To my daughter Eleanor, I bequeath the sum of 5,000 pounds, along with our mother's collection of jewellery and the household silver. Eleanor's sigh was a delicate performance of grief and acquisition. Rose felt nothing but the unyielding wood of the chair against her spine. She expected nothing. It was cleaner that way. Her uncle had provided her with a roof and a rudimentary education after her own parents were taken by the fever. But she was not his child. She was a stray bird he had allowed to shelter in his eaves. Finally, her name. And to my niece, Rose Alcott. The solicitor's voice softened with a note of what sounded like pity. In recognition of her quiet companionship and her appreciation for things others overlook, I leave the painting which hangs above the fireplace in my study. A silence fell, not a respectful one, but a thick, curious hush. Arthur turned his head slowly, a smirk playing on his lips. The painting. Everyone knew the painting. It was a vast, gloomy seascape, so darkened with age and soot as to be almost entirely black. Worse, a leak in the study chimney years ago had left a great pale water stain blooming across one corner, buckling the canvas and causing the paint to flake away like dead skin. It was considered a piece of junk, a permanent fixture of the house's decay. "Is that all?" Eleanor whispered to her brother, loud enough for the room to hear. The solicitor cleared his throat. "That is the final bequest." He began shuffling his papers. The business concluded. Rose felt a flush of heat crawl up her neck. It was a joke, a final cruel joke from a man she thought had cared for her. To be given the one thing in the entire house that was demonstrably, publicly worthless. The one thing that couldn't be sold, couldn't be used, couldn't even be displayed without embarrassment. It was a mark of her status, a public declaration of her value. Nothing. She stood, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I thank you," she murmured to the solicitor. Her voice barely a whisper. Arthur laughed then, a short, sharp bark. "Well, Rose, you'll have something to keep the fire going in your new lodgings, at least." The words hung in the air, sharp and glittering as shattered glass, as the servants were called in to help her take her inheritance down from the wall. The journey back to the single room she had rented above the baker's shop was a study in misery. The painting, wrapped in a coarse sacking cloth, was heavy and awkward. The drizzle had turned to a driving rain, and the hem of her dress was soon soaked with the mud of Dunour's unpaved lane. The canvas seemed to absorb the damp from the air, growing heavier with every step, a physical burden mirroring the weight in her heart. When she finally reached her small attic room, her shoulders ached, and her fingers were numb with cold. Soot, a small ginger cat who had appeared on her doorstep the week her uncle had passed, wound himself around her ankles. A silent, warm question. She leaned the wrapped painting against the wall, the damp sacking smelling of mildew and earth. For a long while, she simply stood there, dripping onto the bare floorboards, listening to the rain lash against the roof slates. This was it, the sum of her life so far. A cold room, a stray cat, and a ruined painting. She felt a profound loneliness, a sense of being utterly unmed in the world. Her uncle, the last person who had truly seen her, was gone. In his place was this monument to her own worthlessness. She built a small fire in the grate, more for the cheer of the light than for any real warmth, and unwrapped the canvas. It was worse than she remembered. In the flickering firelight, the sea in the painting was a black churning void, the sky a bruised purple grey. The water stain was a ghostly presence, an ethereal blight that had bleached the life from the corner of the scene. The heavy ornate frame was dark with grime and stained where the water had run down its gilded edges. Arthur's words echoed in her mind, something to keep the fire going. For a moment, she considered it. The frame was thick oak. It would burn for hours. It would be a fitting end, a final defiant act of erasure. But as she looked at it, something held her back. A memory surfaced, brief and clear as a winter morning. Her uncle standing before this very painting, a pipe in his hand. "Most people see the storm, Rose," he had said quietly, his voice raspy with tobacco. "They see the waves and the dark clouds. But the artist was painting the light. See there? Just a sliver of it on the horizon. That's the whole point." She had been a child then, and had seen only the gloom. Looking now, she still saw only the gloom. But she remembered his words. She remembered the look on his face, a kind of quiet reverence. He had seen something she could not. Perhaps it was a final lesson, to look for the light, even in the deepest dark. With a sigh that seemed to pull from the very soles of her feet, she propped the painting on a crate near the hearth, angled so the warmth of the fire might gently dry the damp from its ancient bones. What was she to do now? Where could she possibly go with nothing but a ruined canvas and a heart full of grief? Was there any hope left for a girl with no family, no fortune, and no prospects? Or was her cousin right, and this painting was nothing more than a final bitter joke? Let us know in the comments what you think Rose should do next, and be sure to subscribe for the rest of her story. For as the fire began to warm the old wood and canvas, a secret that had slept for 50 years was beginning to stir. The next morning, Rose awoke to the smell of baking bread from the shop below, and the relentless patter of rain on the roof. The fire had died to grey ashes, and a damp chill had settled deep into the room. She forced herself to rise, to wash her face with cold water from the pitcher, to pin her hair into its severe knot. There was no time for self-pity. She had a few shillings saved, enough for a week's rent, and perhaps a little food. But after that, she would have to find work, needlework perhaps, or service in one of the larger houses in the next town over. The thought was a lean weight in her stomach. She dressed and made her way down the narrow stairs and out into the cobbled market square. The air was clean and sharp after the rain, the stones of the square gleaming like polished slate. She was heading for the draper shop to ask if they had any mending work to be taken in, when a familiar voice cut through the morning air. Well, well, the lady of the manor come to inspect her new domain. Arthur was standing outside the coaching inn, flanked by two of his well-dressed friends. He was holding a riding crop, tapping it impatiently against his polished leather boot. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on her worn dress and the patched elbows of her shawl. His friends snickered. Rose stopped, her face pale. She wanted to turn to walk away, but she would not give him the satisfaction. She simply stood and met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Good morning, Arthur," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I see you're enjoying your inheritance." His smile was a thin, cruel line. "I am. And you, cousin, have you found a place for your masterpiece? Perhaps the pigsty could use some decoration." His friends laughed openly now. Rose felt the familiar heat of shame, but she held it back, banking it like a coal deep inside her. "It is more than I expected," she replied, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Is it now?" he scoffed, taking a step toward her. "My father was a sentimental old fool. He saw value in things no one else did. Stray cats, stray nieces, broken paintings. It is a weakness, you see. One I do not share." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Take a piece of advice, Rose. Burn it. Take the pittance a rag and bone man will give you for the frame, and buy yourself a hot meal. It's more than it's worth." He tapped her lightly on the shoulder with his crop, a gesture of ultimate dismissal, before turning on his heel and striding into the inn, his friends following like jackals. Rose stood frozen for a moment, the jeers of the men echoing in the square. The townspeople who had witnessed the exchange quickly looked away, busying themselves with their errands, not wanting to be drawn into the affairs of the gentry. She was alone, as she had always been. She turned away from the drapers and began walking with no destination in mind, her errand forgotten. She found herself on the path that led to the parish church, its stone spire, a grey finger pointing to a grey sky. As she passed the lich gate, she saw a stooped figure tending the graves. It was Mrs. Gable, who had been her uncle's housekeeper for 40 years, before being dismissed by Arthur the day after the funeral. The old woman looked up, her face a road map of wrinkles, her eyes as pale and cloudy as winter sea lass. She straightened slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. "Miss Rose," she said, her voice thin and ready. A hard morning. Rose simply nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Mrs. Gable watched her for a long moment, her gaze knowing. "Your uncle was a good man," she said finally. "He didn't see the world the way others do." She gestured with a gnarled hand back toward the great house hidden behind the ancient yews. That house is full of secrets. He knew them all. She took a step closer, her voice dropping so low Rose had to lean in to hear. "Some things are best kept in the dark, my dear," the old woman murmured, her eyes fixed on Rose's face. "The damp preserves what the light might spoil until the right eyes come looking." Without another word, she turned back to her work, leaving Rose standing in the wet grass, the cryptic words hanging in the air like mist, a strange and unsettling premonition she could not yet understand. That evening, the room was quiet, save for the soft hiss of the fire and the rhythmic purr of the cat, who now slept soundly on the hearthrug. Rose sat on the floor, her back against the rough plaster wall, and simply looked at the painting. It leaned against the crate where she had left it, a dark and brooding presence in the small space. After her encounters with Arthur and Mrs. Gable, it no longer felt like a mere object. It felt like a riddle, a burden, and a question all at once. The firelight danced across its surface, catching on the raised ridges of cracked paint, sinking into the deep, impenetrable shadows of the sea. It was a ruin, a beautiful, desolate ruin. Her uncle's words came back to her. The artist was painting the light. She tried to see it. She narrowed her eyes, tilted her head, tried to peer past the grime and the damage. But there was only darkness. The sliver of light he had spoken of was either lost to the decay or had never been there at all. She rose and moved closer, drawn by an impulse she didn't understand. She ran a tentative finger over the canvas. It was rough, gritty with dust, and strangely stiff, as though the canvas itself had petrified. The water stain was a pale map-like continent spreading across the lower right corner. The paint there was peeling, lifting in tiny brittle curls. Beneath it, the canvas was the color of old sailcloth, stained and discolored. The frame was another matter entirely. It was at least 6 in wide, carved with elaborate but grimy scrollwork. It was made of a dark wood, almost black, and felt impossibly heavy. She tried to lift one corner and was surprised by its sheer mass. It was far heavier than a simple oak frame should be. It felt solid, as though it were carved from ironwood or filled with stone. Her gaze traced the path the water had taken down the canvas and onto the gilded inner edge of the frame. The gilt was flaking there, revealing the dark wood beneath. But something was wrong. The stain didn't stop at the wood. It seemed to have soaked into it, leaving a dark, tide-like mark. She knelt, bringing her candle closer. Soot, disturbed by her movement, opened one green eye, gave a flick of his tail, and went back to sleep. Rose ignored him, her attention wholly captured. She examined the corner of the frame where the damage was worst. The carved ailanthus leaves were softened, their details blurred by years of damp. As her fingers traced the pattern, they brushed against something hard and sharp. A tiny nub of metal no bigger than a pinhead protruding from the deepest part of a carved leaf. It was almost invisible, covered in the same dark grime as the rest of the frame. It was not a nail. It was too small, too regular. It looked like the head of a brass pin, deliberately set. Curiosity, sharp and insistent, pierced through her grief. She thought of Mrs. Gable's words, "until the right eyes come looking." Was this what she meant? This tiny, almost imperceptible detail, a loose thread in a tapestry of neglect. She pressed it gently. Nothing happened. It was firm, unmoving, a dead end. Disappointment washed over her. It was just a pin, a stray piece of hardware from a long-ago repair. It meant nothing, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just stumbled upon the edge of something. A question hidden in plain sight, waiting in the dark. For 2 days, the painting leaned against the wall, a silent challenge. Rose went about her small routines. She found a little mending work from the draper, enough to buy bread and milk. She sat by her window, stitching collars and cuffs, her fingers moving with practiced skill, while her mind circled back again and again to the frame. The weight of it, the tiny brass pin, Mrs. Gable's strange pronouncement. It was a puzzle with no solution, a lock with no key. On the 3rd day, she could bear it no longer. The feeling that she was missing something was a constant low hum beneath the surface of her thoughts. After her meager supper of bread and cheese, she took her candle and knelt once more before the painting. Soot came and rubbed against her arm, a rumbling purr vibrating through his small body as if offering encouragement. She looked at the pin again. It was set deep within the carving, designed to be overlooked. What if it wasn't meant to be pressed? What if it was meant to be pulled? She had no proper tools. Her possessions amounted to the clothes on her back, a few books, and her sewing kit. From the kit, she took a small, sturdy pair of tweezers. Her heart began to beat a little faster. It felt like a transgression, a violation of her uncle's memory. But his own words propelled her forward, an appreciation for things others overlook. He had left it to her for a reason. Surely the reason was not for it to rot in her damp attic room. Taking a deep breath, she carefully gripped the head of the pin with the tweezers. It was slippery with grime. Her first attempt failed, the tweezers sliding off. She wiped the pinhead with a corner of her apron, took a firmer grip, and pulled. For a moment, there was resistance. Then, with a faint, dry, scraping sound, the pin began to move. It was longer than she expected, a full inch of polished brass sliding out from the dark wood. It was not a pin at all. It was a locking rod. As the last of it came free, there was a soft but distinct click from within the frame. Rose stared. Her breath held. Nothing else happened. The frame looked exactly the same, but the sound had been undeniable. It was the sound of a mechanism releasing. Her hands trembling slightly, she laid the painting flat on the floor, the dark seascape facing up. She ran her fingers along the edge of the frame where she had pulled the pin. The seam between the mitered corners now had a tiny, almost invisible gap. It was no longer perfectly flush. Using her fingernails, she pried at the corner. The wood groaned in protest. It was stiff with age and damp, but it was moving. Slowly, carefully, she worked the corner joint apart. It wasn't a joint at all. It was a hinge. The entire side piece of the heavy frame was swinging outward, revealing not the edge of the canvas, but a hollow cavity within the wood itself. The frame was a box, a long, narrow, cleverly concealed box. The weight, she now realized, was not from the wood, but from what lay inside. A heavy oilcloth-wrapped parcel was nestled within the hidden compartment, fitting the space perfectly. Her hands shook as she reached in and lifted it out. What had she found? What secret had her quiet, bookish uncle hidden away inside a worthless painting? The parcel was surprisingly heavy, wrapped in waxed oilcloth and tied with thread twine that was brittle with age. It smelled faintly of dust and linseed oil. For a moment, Rose simply held it in her hands. The weight of it, a tangible thing in the quiet room. This was real. This was not a dream. The fire crackled in the grate, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Soot, sensing the gravity of the moment, sat perfectly still, his green eyes wet and fixed on the strange object in her lap. With fumbling fingers, she worked at the knots in the twine. They crumbled under the pressure, turning to dust. She unfolded the stiff, creaking oilcloth. Inside, nestled in a bed of what looked like dried wool fleece, were 3 items. The first was a small leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth with handling. The second was a single heavy iron key, its bit intricately cut, a faint bloom of rust coloring its shank. And the third, lying beneath the others, was a rolled sheet of vellum, yellowed with age, and sealed with a blob of dark red wax, bearing the imprint of her uncle's signet ring. Her breath caught in her throat. She picked up the journal first. The leather was cool and supple. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was her uncle's. The familiar spidery script she had seen on countless notes and book margins. The entry was dated 30 years prior. I have made my decision. It began. My sons see only coin. They see the land as something to be sold, the house as something to be stripped, the name as something to be leveraged. They do not understand that our wealth is not in the bank, but in the soil. It is in the history of this place, in the stewardship of it. They would squander it in a generation. And so I will do what my own grandfather did. I will hide it. I will hide the heart of it, the true deed and legacy, where only one with the patience to look past the surface will ever think to find it. I will trust it not to the cleverest or the strongest, but to the quietest, to the one who knows that some things of value make no sound at all. Rose felt a wave of emotion, so powerful it almost knocked the air from her lungs. Grief, love, and a profound, bone-deep sense of being seen. He had not forgotten her. He had not insulted her. He had chosen her. This was not a punishment. It was a test she had by some miracle passed. Her hands shaking, she carefully broke the wax seal on the vellum scroll and unrolled it. It was not a legal document, but a map. It was a hand-drawn rendering of the Dunora estate, but it was unlike any map she had ever seen. The familiar landmarks were there. The great house, the spinney, the river. But there were other markings, strange symbols and annotations in her uncle's script. A dotted line led from the house not toward the main grounds, but to a section marked simply as the Forgotten Garden, Clear's Throat, a walled-off acre at the far edge of the property that had been abandoned for half a century. A large X was marked on a spot near the north wall beside a drawing of a crumbling stone well. Next to it were the words, "Where the water sleeps, the root begins." It was a treasure map, a real and genuine treasure map left for her and her alone. She had not been left a worthless painting. She had been left a quest, a key, and a legacy of trust that was more precious than all the silver in Dunor House. That night, Rose did not sleep. She sat by the dying embers of the fire, the journal in her lap, and the map spread carefully on the floor, the iron key cold and heavy in her hand. A wild, fierce joy sang in her blood, a feeling so new and unfamiliar she could barely name it. Hope. It felt like hope. But as the night wore on, a new sound began to intrude upon her thoughts. The wind. It started as a low moan in the chimney, a rattling of the window frame. By dawn, it had risen to a furious howl. The sky was a bruised, churning mass of black cloud, and the rain began not as a drizzle, but as a torrential downpour thrown against the little attic window like handfuls of gravel. The storm that had been threatening for days had finally broken, and it was a monster. A leak she had never noticed before began to drip from the ceiling. A steady rhythmic splash onto the floorboards, just a few feet from where the precious map lay. She scrambled to move it, her heart pounding with fear. The one thing of value she had ever possessed, and the world itself seemed to be trying to tear it away. She spent the morning moving her meager belongings away from the widening puddle on the floor. A bucket placed beneath the drip, doing little to stem the flow. The wind shrieked, and the entire building seemed to groan under the assault. Around midday, there was a frantic pounding on her door. It was Arthur. He was soaked to the skin, his fine coat plastered to his shoulders, his face pale with fury and fear. "There's a tree down on the main road," he shouted over the roar of the wind. "The river's rising. They say the old bridge might not hold." He looked around her small, damp room, his eyes filled with contempt. "You can't stay here. This whole place will wash away." He wasn't there out of concern. She knew him better than that. He was there because he was trapped in the village, and the inn was full. "I will be fine," she said, blocking the doorway. He pushed past her, looking at the bucket on the floor. "Fine. Look at this havel. It's falling apart." His eyes fell on the painting, still leaning against the wall, its frame now conspicuously open on one side. "What have you done to that?" he demanded. Before she could answer, a woman's cry came from the street below. A traveling family, their cart overturned by a sudden gust, its axle snapped, were huddled in the doorway of the bakery, a small child wailing in its mother's arms. Without a second thought, Rose pushed past her stunned cousin. "Bring them up here," she called down to the baker's wife. "They can shelter by the fire." Arthur stared at her as if she were mad. "Have you lost your senses? You have nothing." Rose met his gaze, the iron key still clutched in her hand in the pocket of her apron. "I have a fire," she said simply, "and that is more than they have." She spent the rest of the day sharing her last loaf of bread and a pot of wheat tea with the grateful family, while her cousin sulked in a corner, a sour witness to an act of generosity he could not comprehend. In that moment, protecting the map was not just about a future fortune. It was about honoring the trust of a man who believed in kindness over coin. The storm blew itself out by the next evening. leaving behind a world washed clean and utterly still. The travelling family, their cart mended with the help of the baker, had departed at dawn with heartfelt thanks and a promise to remember her kindness. Arthur, humbled and silent for the first time in his life, had left as soon as the road was cleared without so much as a word of farewell. Rose was alone again, but the room did not feel empty. It felt like a sanctuary. That afternoon, with the vellum map tucked safely inside her dress and the iron key in her pocket, she walked to Dunora House. The grounds were a wreck of fallen branches and sodden leaves. She did not go to the main entrance, but followed the map's path along the crumbling outer wall of the estate to a small iron-bound door almost completely obscured by ivy. It was locked, but a different key. Her uncle's own, which Mrs. Gable had pressed into her hand before she left, turned the rusted lock. She stepped through and found herself in a place lost to time. The forgotten garden was a wilderness. What had once been pathways were now streams of mud, the flower beds, a riot of weeds and brambles. But the stone walls were still sound, and in the center, just as the map had shown, was a small circular stone well, its top covered by a thick slab of slate. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. It was a sad, beautiful, secret place. Following the map's instructions, she went to the north wall. She counted the flagstones, paced out the distances, her heart thumping a steady rhythm against her ribs. The X on the map corresponded to a section of the wall where a great climbing rose. Now a thorny, tangled monster had grown for decades. The instructions in the journal were precise. 3 stones down from the top coping, 5 in from the eastern corner. Look for the mason's mark of a hawk. She pulled at the thorny branches, her hands getting scratched and torn until she could see the stonework. And there it was, a small, faint bird carved into the face of a single block of grey stone. It was a loose fit. Using the heavy iron key as a lever, she worked it into the mortar joint and pried. The stone shifted, then scraped outward, revealing a dark, square cavity behind it. Inside was a small iron strongbox, green with vert. It was heavy, solid, and locked. The key she held in her hand, the strange, intricate key from the painting's frame, slid into the lock with a perfect, satisfying click. She turned it. The mechanism, silent for half a century, engaged. The lid lifted. Inside, there was no gold, no jewels. There was only a stack of papers tied with a faded ribbon and a single folded letter on top. The letter was addressed to her. "My dearest Rose," it read. "If you are reading this, then you have seen what others could not. These are not deeds to money, but to land. The north fields, the water meadows, the old quarry, all thought sold off to pay my father's debts. They were not. They were placed in trust. The deeds held by a silent partner in Bristol. These documents restore them to the Dunora estate. The estate, my dear girl, is now whole, and it is yours. Arthur has the house and the home farm, enough to live on. But the heart of the land, its true wealth and future, now rests in your hands. You have proven you are a steward, not a taker. You have earned it." The journey to Bristol with Mr. Davies, the solicitor, was a blur. He had looked at the deeds Rose brought him with stunned, silent reverence. "Miss Alcott," he had said, his voice hushed with awe, "do you have any idea what this is? This isn't a fortune. It's a kingdom. The firm in Bristol confirmed everything. The trust was legitimate, the deeds impeccable. The land, which everyone had assumed belonged to a dozen different owners, had been quietly managed for 50 years, its profits accruing, waiting for the day the true heir presented themselves. When Rose returned to Dunor, the news had already flown ahead of her. It was in the whispers of the town's people, the respectful dip of a head from the shopkeepers, the sudden awkward kindness of her neighbours. She was no longer Rose Alcott, the poor relation. She was Miss Alcott, the A's of the North Fields. One afternoon, she found Arthur waiting for her by the gate to her lodgings. He did not look at her. He stared at the cobblestones, his face pale, his usual arrogance completely stripped away. "The solicitor told me," he muttered. "The lands, the quarry." He finally lifted his head, and in his eyes she saw not anger, but a profound and shattering bewilderment. He simply could not comprehend it. "A painting," he said, his voice barely a whisper. It was all in a worthless, broken painting. He did not apologize. He did not ask for anything. He simply stated the fact that had undone his world, the fact that a thing he had dismissed as firewood had held the true power, while the grand house he had inherited was now merely a fraction of the whole. Rose looked at him, at the cousin who had mocked her, who had been so certain of his place in the world, and she felt a flicker of the pity the solicitor had once shown her. "He left you the house, Arthur," she said quietly. "That is not nothing." He just shook his head and walked away, a man diminished not by poverty, but by a failure of imagination. The chorus of village whispers had changed its tune. The laughter had turned to awe. They spoke of her as the girl who had found the lost fortune, the one her clever uncle had chosen. But Rose knew the truth was simpler. She hadn't found a fortune. She had simply been given a chance to look closer. Weeks turned into months. The autumn chill gave way to the hard frost of winter, and then the slow green thaw of spring. Rose did not move into the great house. She took a small tenant cottage on the edge of the water meadows, a simple stone building with a slate roof and a garden that ran down to the river. She used the funds from the trust not for silks or carriages, but to hire local men to begin the long, slow work of restoring the forgotten garden. The walls were repaired, the pathways cleared, the ancient thorny roses pruned back to reveal their strong, vital heartwood. She found she had a talent for it, a feel for the soil, an understanding of what needed to be cleared away and what needed to be nurtured. She was not a grand lady. She was a gardener. One evening in the soft golden light of late afternoon, she stood by the old stone well, her hands covered in soil, a deep sense of peace settling over her. The first of the new plantings were taking root. The rescued stranger, the father of the family she had sheltered during the storm, had returned weeks ago, a master carpenter who now worked for her. His gratitude, a quiet, steady presence. He had just finished building a new cold frame for her seedlings. She looked at the rich, dark earth, at the promise of life stirring within it, at the restored walls that held this secret place safe. She thought of the painting, which now hung in her small cottage, cleaned and restored by a craftsman from the city. In the clean light, you could finally see it. The tiny, brilliant sliver of light on the horizon, the single point of hope in the heart of a storm. Her uncle had been right. It had been there all along. The carpenter approached, wiping his hands on his apron. "It's good work you're doing here, miss," he said, his voice sincere, bringing something back to life. Rose smiled, a real unbeburdened smile. She looked around at the garden, at the legacy of trust she had been given. "He didn't leave me a fortune," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "He left me a beginning. Thank you for staying with us to the very end of Rose's journey." Her story is a powerful reminder of the value of seeing what others overlook, and of the quiet strength it takes to look for the light in the darkness. If you were moved by her tale, please consider leaving a like and a comment below. And be sure to subscribe for more stories of hidden treasures and unexpected legacies. We'll see you again very